Hey guys, this is Carrie, and in this video, we're going to be continuing to add to our game. So we've got a working player right now that we can control with the arrow keys that Pac-Man's through the wall. But it's not a very fun game because we don't have anything to do. So in this video, we're going to be working on adding food items onto the screen so that our player can go around and collect stationary foods. So just organizationally, what I was thinking is all the stuff I wrote last time after draw background was related to the player. So I'm going to put a comment here for myself that this was player stuff. And then after I have the event listeners, I have this set interval loop. I guess in between those, I'm going to be programming my food. So I'm going to write food stuff, and then I'm going to call this the game loop. So I'm going to be adding all of the food stuff here. So last time, we did something really clever with our player. We thought that the player had a lot of information that we needed to keep track of. So what we did was we made a list that kept track of all of that important information. It was called the player info list, and it stored the X and Y coordinates of where the player currently is. So he starts at 400, 300, but obviously these are changing as we move around. And it also stores the speed that the player is traveling at. And I thought we could use a really similar idea for our food. One thing that's going to make the food a little bit easier, though, is in my imagination of the game, the food isn't moving. So I'm not going to have to include an X speed or a Y speed. I'll just have X and Y coordinates for each food item. So I'm going to start off down here. I'm going to say let food 1 equal. And I'm going to put this food up here at, say, 400, 100. Oh, let me make a little note to myself. Foods have structure X, Y. So they only get 2 coordinates in their list, X and Y coordinates. I'm going to say let food 2 equal, and these can really be anything that you want. I'm going to say maybe 600, 500. And then maybe I'll have a food 3. And this one will be 100, 200. Okay. So let me refresh my screen. So I do have those foods in my computer's memory, but I haven't told my my program to actually draw the foods at those locations. So what I'm thinking is the same way that next we had a draw player function, I think it would be a good idea to have a draw food function. So function draw food. And what the draw food function is going to do is it's going to take in some food info. So I'm imagining that it will take in information like this. And that's very similar to what our draw player function did. Our draw player function had to read in this information from the list. And so when I'm thinking about the draw food function, I'm thinking that since this is going to be the X coordinate, this is going to be the Y coordinate, I could just draw a circle at those locations. Luckily, one of our functions that we have from the toolbox is this draw circle function, very similar to the player. So I'm going to copy and paste the draw circle structure from my definition. And I'm going to bring that down here. So whenever I draw a food item, I want to read in a list that has the X and Y coordinates, the food info. And then I want to draw a circle, and I want the X coordinate of that circle, so I'm replacing the X variable with food info. And it's going to read in the 0th coordinate from each one of these in the future, but from 1. The Y coordinate will be the 1th coordinate, the one here. Oops, food info, 1. The radius could be whatever we want. I'm going to try out 30 to see how that looks. And for the color, I think if I have red food, that would be kind of cool, like an apple or something. So now that I've got my draw food function programmed, I'm going to test it out by drawing food 1. So draw food. I'm going to call this function. I'm telling the computer, hey, this is how you draw food. Now draw food with the food 1 information plugged into it. Let's see if this draws a food item right here. Oh my gosh, it did draw it for like a split second. And that's kind of silly. Of course, what's happening is it draws it for a split second, and then it goes into our game loop. So it immediately draws a background on top of it, covering it up. And then every 20 milliseconds, it redraws that background. So what maybe I should do here is I should move this draw food function into my set interval loop. Okay, nice. So now I've got the food there, and it doesn't interact with my player because I haven't taught the computer what it means for the food to interact with the player. All right, so I noticed that I'm just drawing one of my food items. I think what could be good is for me to write another function that's called draw all food. And what I'm imagining now is I want to draw all of my food items. And I'm running into a little bit of a problem, which is that all of my foods are kind of these separate objects. And I'm not really sure that I'm always going to have exactly 3 foods in the game. So I'm thinking that something I could do is, let me just put my parentheses here so that I don't forget to do that. Something I'm thinking is that I could actually store all of my foods inside of a list of foods. Okay, so I'm going to say let foods equal, and currently inside of my foods list, I've got food 1, I've got food 2, and I've got food 3. So I've got a foods list that contains all of my foods. So what's going to happen with the draw all food function is I'm going to read in this foods list. And then what it's going to do is I want to take all of the foods in the list, and for each one of those, the singular descriptor that would apply to each one of those as I go through it is food. So I want to take my foods list, and for each food, food 1, and then food 2 will be food, and then food 3 will be food, I want to draw the food that I'm currently on. All right, so what I'm going to do is test this out now. Instead of just drawing one food, I'm going to change this in my set interval loop to draw all food. And that's going to read in the foods list. All right, cool. So it looks like the for each loop worked. So the for each loop is drawing each of my food items. So food 1, food 2, and food 3, each of them from the foods list. All right, this is looking pretty good so far. Still, the food doesn't interact with the player. I'm thinking the next thing, though, is it's a little bit boring for me to always have the same configuration of foods. So what I'm thinking is I'd like to have a function that would create foods at random locations. And this will also be useful for when I write my update foods function, where when I collect the food, I'm going to have new food appearing at different locations. So over here, I'm going to write a function which is the create food function. And the create food function isn't going to need any extra information. So what I'm thinking is, in order to make a food, I need to generate an x coordinate and a y coordinate. And the best way to create these will be to create these randomly. So I'm going to go to my toolbox. And whenever I want to create things randomly, I need to have the generate random function earlier in my code. So up here in the important functions from my toolbox, I get these don't let me draw basic shapes, but it feels like this is the right place. It's part of the functions that I got from the toolbox. So maybe I'll just delete that. Okay, so now I have the generate random function, and it takes in a minimum number and a maximum number. So what I'm going to do for my foods is I'm going to say let x equal generate a random number from 0 to 800. And that way it has an x coordinate that will fit on the screen. Let y equal generate a random number from y equals 0 to y equals 600. And then the last part about creating a food is, remember, each food is stored as a list. And each of those food lists are added to our foods list. That's kind of like I just said list many times. But what I want to do is I want to take the foods list and I want to add my new food onto it. So when I add things onto a list, that's actually using the append function. So I want to append to foods. Sorry, one more thing. I guess I'm going to say let new food equal x comma y. The new food will be the list that instead of having 400 and 100 like food 1 has, the new food will have this random x coordinate and then this random y coordinate. And then I want to append to the foods list, this list right here, my new food item. And really hard for us to remember is append is actually not a function that's built into JavaScript. It's one that comes from our toolbox. So whenever we use these list methods or array functions, I have to take this line of JavaScript, this line of HTML, and I have to put this into my HTML file before my script tags. So what this is doing is it's importing in some tools that I wrote for arrays, and that includes the append function. So now the append function here should work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a food down here by calling the create foods function. So what I should have now, if my program is working, is I should have the 3 foods that I created before in my foods list. And then I should create a new food item, which will be a random one, and that will be a 4th one here. I won't see the list, but I will see 4 food items, and one of them should be bouncing around. And so pretty nice here, because the draw all foods function loops through the list, it doesn't care whether I have 3 or 4 or 5 foods. I can sort of create as many foods as I want. So right now I should have the 3 foods from here, plus 3 random foods. So I have, 6 foods, awesome. And 3 of those bounce around while 3 of them stay in the same position. All right, so I guess what I was imagining when I was creating this game is I don't have any of these foods that have specific data points at the start. So I'm going to delete food 1, food 2, and food 3. I'm also going to take out all of those foods from this list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say my foods list starts empty. Then I have the create food function, and I'm going to create 1, 2, 3 food items. These 3 food items will go inside of this, and those food items are always random. Next up, I've got a couple of functions for drawing foods. Let me just make sure I have 3 foods. Okay, and all 3 of them randomly change position. Sweet. All right, so I think I'm ready to do the last part with the create foods function, which is to write in how they update. So my player updates by having its x and y coordinates change depending on its speed, as well as having the ability to walk through walls. So that was this part right here, update player with player info. For my foods, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to write an update, I don't want to capitalize the first letter, update all food function. This is going to read in my foods list. So what's nice is my foods don't move. I think the only thing I have to worry about is I have to worry about if my player is too close to a food item. Then I want to eat that food and create a new food. So let me make a little comment note there. If my player is too close to a food, eat the food and make a new one. Okay, so I need to translate this idea that's kind of like an idea we understand into an idea that's in computer code. So what does it mean for the player to be too close? I guess that depends on how far apart my player is from the food. So what I need to do is I need to have a way to measure the distance between my player and to food. And luckily, this is a pretty well-known formula in math. It's called the distance formula. And he may have wrote a function for this earlier in the year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that as we go through the game, we should constantly compute the distance between the player and each food item. How far apart am I? 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 Luckily, we don't have to do any of the math. We're just going to write a function here for this. So I'm thinking that I'm going to put this function, let's see. I'm not really sure where to put it organizationally. I guess since I'm going to be using it here, I'll put it here for now. I'll write a function called getDistance. And getDistance is going to read in two objects. I guess it's going to, let's see, what should I call those things? Yeah, I guess I can call it two objects. It's going to read in object 1, and it's going to read in object 2. And the reason why I'm being a little bit abstract about what specifically these things are is in the future, I'm going to have to do something very similar for my enemies. So I'll be reading in the player and the enemy. All right, so when I get the distance between, when I get the distance between two objects, what I want to do is I want to define x1 to be equal to, go into object 1, and get the 0th position, or 0th item. So in our food, well, the food's not an easy one. I'll go back to the player. All of the items in our game are going to have a structure where the x-coordinate is the 0th one, and the y-coordinate is the 1th one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get these variables from my formula, x1 and x2, y1 and y2 from the objects. So the first x-coordinate is the 0th coordinate from object 1. The first y-coordinate is the 1th coordinate from object 1. The second x-coordinate will be the 0th x-coordinate, object 2. And the second y-coordinate will be the first coordinate from object 2. And then what I want to do is let distance equal math.square root, and I'm just copying this formula from here, x2 minus x1 squared. Oops, that's not how we write squared in JavaScript, squared, plus y2 minus y1 squared. So I put in that formula here. This formula computes the distance. That's d. And then from here, I want to return the distance. All right. So I guess one of the things that I want to do when I have the update all foods function is I want to take my foods list and I want to say for each food, oops, I need two parentheses there. For each food, do this. I'm going to say calculate the distance between the player and that food item. So let distance equal, get the distance between player info, that's going to be the first object, and then the food that we're currently up to, which will be one of those XY coordinates like this. I see that my update all food function is actually reading in the player info as well. So I'm going to actually add player info as one of the parameters that I'm inputting into this. Okay, so take the foods and go through the foods list. For each food, compute the distance between the player and that food. If my player's too close to a food, if the distance is less than, let's see, my player's radius when I drew the player, let me just scroll up here, was 50. And my food's radius is 30. So it looks like if I'm just touching, it should be the player radius 50 plus, or sorry, is it 50? I'll look again, 50 plus the food radius 30. Let me just make sure it was 50. Yeah, it was 50. So that would be 80 away. I'm going to make it look like they overlap a little. So I'm going to say if the distance is less than 60, then I want to say that that the food is being eaten. So I'm going to start off by just console.logging the word yum because we're eating the food. So let me open up the console and let me see if I can eat the food. All right, so here we go. Okay, I noticed that I'm not eating the food, and I did something really stupid. I wrote this update all foods function, but I forgot to put that in my set interval loop. So similar to the player, I guess before I draw all the food, I'm going to say update all food. And when we update all the food, I have to read in the player info, and I have to read in the foods. So now as part of my game loop, every time through the loop, it should be checking to see if I'm eating the food and then drawing the foods. Let's see if this works now. All right, so I'm not eating the food. And then I scroll over here and nothing's happening. So let's see why. My distance is less than 60. Console.log yum. Let me just type in over here my foods list. So my foods list is working. I have a list of 3 foods. That looks great. And I'm getting the distance between these 2. And I'm reading in the player info. And, oh, here's something silly I did. The distance here, when I get the distance, it should be the distance between the player info and the food item that I'm currently on. So it should be this. Not foods. I'm finding the distance between a player and a singular food. Let me see if this works now. All right, so here we go. I'm controlling the player. Yum, 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 yum. Oh, sweet. Okay, cool. That one works. I'm going to go over to this one and check it out. Yum, 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 yum. And I can see that going up in the little counter up here. Yum, 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 yum. Awesome. So I think we've got everything computed correctly. But we don't really want our game to just say yum in the console here. We really want a couple of things to happen when we eat the food. We want the food to disappear and reappear somewhere else. Or we want to eat the food and make a new food. And we also want our score to appear here and increase. So I'm going to work on making the food disappear and then have a new piece of food appear. So in our array tools, we learned a function that would be really useful for this. It was the... Oh my gosh, I don't know why those files came up. It will be the remove function. So when I use the remove function, I have to say remove from foods, and then I tell it which food to remove by using the index number, like 0, 1, 2, or 3. So I want to remove the food that I'm currently on if I'm eating the food. So I think what I need to do is I need to have a counter that keeps track of which food I'm currently up to. So when I update all foods, I'm going to have a counter that says let food index equal 0, because I'll start with the 0th food from my foods list. And then for each food, what I want to do is if the distance is less than 60, if I'm close to the food, I want to remove, nope, it's using an autocomplete. Remove from the foods list the food that's at the food index. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if I'm eating the 0th food. And if I'm not, I'm going to check to see if I'm eating the first food. And if I'm not, I'm going to check to see if I'm eating the second food. So I need to have this food index increase each time I look at the next food. So each time I go through this, compute the distance. If the distance is less than 60, yum, and then remove the food. And then after the if statement, I would like food index to move on to the next food from the list. So if I'm checking the 0th food, it should be the 0th food plus 1. Let's see if that works. So when I move through now, what it should do is it should actually eat the food. Yum. 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 Cool. And now the game is over. So it's not very fun. So what I need to do is I need to have it make a new food. Luckily, we actually have a tool for making new foods, which is the create food function. So if my distance is less than 60, yum, I eat the food, then I remove the food because it's eaten, and then I will create food. And that will add a new food item. Let's see if that works. Oops, I have to use the arrow keys here. So food, yum. And I can see that now that when I'm eating it, it's actually creating a new food each time I eat one. Pretty cool. And the last bit here is the score bit. So I think here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say when I start my game, my score starts off at 0. When I eat the food, I guess before I eat the food, kind of, I'm thinking in my mind, my score should be equal to whatever my score was before, starting at 0, but 100 points higher. So if my score is 300, when I eat the food, it will be, my new score is 300 plus 100, 400. And I actually need to have a way to show that score somewhere on the screen. So I'm thinking to show the score here at the top left. So I loaded up this cheat sheet for myself about how to write text on the screen. And I'm thinking down here, I'd like to have a function called show score, or I could call it whatever I want. And it's going to read in the score. And then it's going to figure out how to write the score on the canvas. So a lot of these canvas commands are not super familiar to us, but I'm just going to take this from here, and I'm going to think about how I might change it. So yeah, it's going to take my context, set the font to be whatever this is, take my context and fill this text, hello world at 1050. I'm just going to try this out. So every time through my loop, I also want it to make sure that it's showing the score on the screen. So show score reads in the score item, or the score variable. Oop, not score variable. All right, let me reload here. Okay, so it's putting hello world there, and I guess the way it's working is this is the x coordinate is 10, and then the y coordinate is 50. Let me try it out with 10, 10, and see how that looks. That does not look great. So 1030, let's see how that looks. Okay, that's kind of where I want my score to be. I like that. I don't really want the color to be red. So I think what I have to do is I think I have to just grab the ctx.fillStyle line. And I know that these functions are not familiar to us from the canvas. They're functions that kind of make sense though. We're going to set the fill style to be the color black, the font to be 30 pixels RL, and then we're going to fill in the text hello world. Let's just see if that's black first. Okay, sick. That works. And then instead of saying hello world here, I'm going to say let text equal the word score ... space plus whatever the score is. And then instead of writing hello world here, what I'd like to write is I'd like to write the text that's being stored in this variable. So let's see if that works now. Okay, cool. So I've got the score showing up there. And as I go around, I eat the food, and my score goes up by 100. So I think we might have the foods fully programmed at this point. I am going to delete my console.log yum because that was part of my strategy for coding. It wasn't really something that I wanted to be a feature for my game. I'm going to close my console down here, and I'm just going to think for a second to make sure everything is complete. All right, so I have 3 randomly generating foods that use the create food function. Every time through, it draws a red circle where each of the foods is. And then every time I update my food, it makes a new food when I eat it, and it also increases my score. I think I've got it. All right, guys, that's the end of the foods. Next time we'll make the bad guys, and I'll see you in class. Bye.